Okay, thank you very much. And good morning, everyone, once again. During the Middle Ages, about 600 species of plants were available in Northwestern Europe. And these were mostly native plants. But from the 16th century on, however, an influx of new plants began. And these exotic plants were only available to botanists and a small, wealthy elite of garden enthusiasts. Next slide, please. Now, this morning, I would like to talk a bit about the introduction of these new plants and about the new technologies that made cultivating these plants possible, and also about the role Dutch nurserymen played in this process. Now, first, I will focus on the introduction of bulbs from the Levant, then on Mediterranean plants and subtropical and tropical plants from South Africa, parts of Central America, and parts of Southeast Asia in the 17th century. Then on the trade in trees grown in Holland and then transported to Northern European countries. Third, on the introduction of trees and shrubs from North America in the 18th century. And finally, on the introduction of plants from Japan in the 19th century. And maybe most importantly, I would like you to meet one of those very skilled Dutch florists who cultivated all these plants. Next, please. Now, you probably know the story of the tulip. It was Auger Ghislain de Busbecq, ambassador to Turkey, who is credited with being the first to introduce the tulip to Europe around 1554. He sent some tulip bulbs to the court of the Habsburg Emperor in Vienna and Prague, and the tulip instantly became very popular and impressed everybody with its beauty. Botanists working for the imperial courts studied the bulbs that were unknown until then, and they propagated them. And via Vienna and other royal courts, the tulip spread across Europe, aided by an international network of botanists and enthusiasts. Now, at first, the spread of tulips didn't always go smoothly. A Flemish merchant from Antwerp, for example, mistook these precious bulbs for onions. He actually roasted them and ate them with some oil and vinegar. I doubt they were tasty, though. Next, please. When the botanist Carolus Clusius came to Leiden in Holland to accept the post of professor at Leiden University, he brought with him his collection of tulips and other bulbs. These bulbs were planted out in the newly laid out botanical garden in Leiden, of which you see an engraving on the slide. The bulbs were so sought after that some of them were even stolen. Next, please. So Clusius had a fence erected around the bed of bulbs to keep the thieves out. I don't think it was much of a success though. Next, please. Bulbs were very expensive and a lot of money could be made growing them. So a number of craftsmen started growing bulbs in their backyard as a second income. Some of them were so good at growing these flowers, they made it their full-time job and established themselves as florists in and near the biggest cities in Holland. Besides tulips, they grew a variety of flowers such as anemones, ranunculus, fritillaries, primroses, and hyacinths. And these florists tried to cultivate as many varieties as possible, looking for different colors and looking for different shapes. Next, please. At first, the tulip was loved most, but by the early 18th century, the hyacinth was a favorite. It became quite a craze because it smelled delicious and it bloomed in early spring. Florists initially grew only single hyacinths. You can see it on the left side of the slide. Sometimes, however, double hyacinths would arise spontaneously, but these were considered monstrosities and thrown out. Dutch florist Peter Voorhelm from Haarlem was always keen to discard these seedlings. One day, however, he fell seriously ill and had to stay in bed for some period of time. When he was finally able to go to work again, he discovered a small double hyacinth in his garden. It had escaped the attention of his workers, and the hyacinth had come into full bloom. Voorhelm was struck by its beauty and left the hyacinth standing. As it turned out, his customers also liked this new flower and wanted to buy it. So Voorhelm decided to grow double hyacinths. Soon other florists followed suit and started growing them as well. Now you can see the double hyacinth in the middle of the slide, and on the right hand side is a picture of George Voorhelm. He is grandson to Peter Voorhelm, and he's the one who wrote down this story about how his grandfather grew these special hyacinths. And that's how we know. Now, florists did not limit themselves to growing bulbs. They also started cultivating Mediterranean plants, especially citrus trees. Now, these citrus trees amaze people because of their ability to bear both blossom and fruit at the same time. And besides, their fragrance was wonderful. The first citrus trees that reached the Netherlands came from Italy and from Portugal, and the cost of transportation made these trees quite expensive. Moreover, you needed to have a place to store the trees over winter, otherwise they wouldn't survive the cold. Now, because of all this, having a collection of citrus trees became a token of riches and prosperity. Next, please. So no wonder florists were eager to grow these plants for their customers, and they were quite successful at it. The important thing was that a citrus tree had to have a perfectly straight trunk. In practice, it wasn't always the case, of course, and then a so-called straightener, you can see it on the left side of the slide, came in handy. By placing a stick against the trunk of the tree and putting on a bit more pressure every day, you supposedly could make the trunk grow perfectly straight over time. Now, Holland was a seafaring nation at that time, trading all over the world. The Dutch East India Company was created in 1602 and the West India Company a few years later. Both companies established headquarters in different parts of Asia, South Africa, and Central America. The company ships not only brought back all kinds of goods, but also exotic seeds and tubers. And thanks to the transport of these seeds on a small scale, these companies, and especially the East India Company, played an important role in introducing exotic plants to Europe. Physicians and botanists regularly traveled along and studied local flora. For instance, the governor to Dutch Malabar in India, Hendrik van Rede, compiled a botanical treatise on the medicinal properties of flora of the Malabar coast, with the aid of a local expert, of course. The treatise was entitled Hortus Malabaricus, which means Garden of Malabar, and it was published at the end of the 17th century. Exotic seeds and tubers that arrived in Holland went to botanical gardens and to wealthy acquaintances of company officials. Gardeners and amateur plant lovers would then try to grow these seeds and gather a magnificent collection of exotic plants. Next, please. One of them was a wealthy widow with a great passion for plants. Her name was Magdalena Pouille, and you can see her on the left side of the slide with her nephew. She was very well connected to a company official, and she owned an estate on the river Vecht, which was called Gunterstein. It's still there today. It had a large garden and a very famous collection of rare plants. Over here you can see Gunterstein, and on the left side of it you can see the orangery that Magdalena Pouille had. Next, please. On this engraving of her orangery, you can see she had quite a collection of citrus trees. But even more special, she had hothouses to keep her tropical plants in. The hothouses were built against the orangery, as you can see on the picture. Next, please. And as you can also see on this enlargement, that people were very curious to find out what kind of plants were in her hothouses. Now, the invention of heated tropical greenhouses at the end of the 17th century was essential for cultivating tropical plants and keeping them alive. Gardeners and nurserymen learned how to raise and tend to tropical plants by trial and error. Often seed did not germinate or seedlings died. It took quite an effort to make these plants grow and flower. Next, please. Now, transporting plants overseas was not limited to tropical plants from Asia and Central America. There had been a long-standing tradition of trade between Holland and Northern European countries like Denmark, Sweden, and Russia. And in the 17th and early 18th century, large quantities of lane trees and fruit trees that had been grown in Holland were shipped from the Netherlands to Northern Europe. Trade often took place through the city of Hamburg in present-day Germany. Some tree growers even had permanent trading contacts in Hamburg or, for instance, in Copenhagen. Now, the trees were transported in the hold of a ship and wrapped in reed matting or straw for protection. The roots were covered with soil, a layer of soil, and moss was also used to keep the roots moist. And sometimes even a gardener went along to look after the trees during the journey, that, depending on the weather, could take a few weeks. Now, you may have noticed that these nurserymen played a very important role in the cultivation of plants. And if the technique will help us, I would like you to meet one of them, Adrian Steckhoven. We know what he looks like because his son-in-law made this wonderful bust that is kept in Vienna. So here you see Adrian Steckhoven. He was born in 1705 in a small village in Holland. And his father was most likely a market gardener who taught Adrian his trade. Now, Adrian must have been fascinated by exotic plants from a young age on, but studying botany at Leiden University was far too expensive and out of the question. So at the age of 20, he signed on as a sailor with the East India Company and sailed for Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. And while his ship lay at anchor in the bay to stock up on fresh supplies, Adrian visited the East India Company's gardens at the Cape and studied the local flora. After 3 weeks, his ship lifted anchor and sailed for Batavia, which is present-day Jakarta in Indonesia. And over there, Adrian also studied native plants. After a safe return to Holland, he got married and he started his own nursery, which he called the Day Tree. Next, please. At first, he grew bulbs such as hyacinths and ranunculus, as we know from ads in the local paper. In 1733, he earned so much money selling double hyacinths, he was able to buy an extra piece of land and enlarge his nursery. Over a period of 25 years, his nursery gained an excellent reputation, and he made the front page of Dutch newspapers when his banana tree bore fruit several times. Now, his nursery covered more than an acre and included a house, sheds, greenhouses, and hothouses. We don't know what it looked like exactly, but it most likely would have looked like the nursery Tulpenburg, of which you see the map on the right-hand side of the slide. Now, at the bottom was the entrance to the nursery of Tulpenburg and the house of its owner, Zacharias Bragel. And then you see all these beds where bulbs and other plants were grown. You see rows of trees, but on the right-hand upper side, you can see a part of the nursery where people could just walk around, admire the plants, sit down, and ponder what plants they were going to buy. And I think the nursery of Adrian Steckhoven would have been much like this one. Adrian Steckhoven employed several people, including pupils, and ended up earning an average income of 4,000 guilders a year. Now, the average income of a head gardener at that time in Holland was 500 to 600 guilders a year, so he was quite prosperous. And his nursery was estimated at a value of 9,000 guilders. In 1753, he received an invitation to come to Vienna and create a botanical garden for the Habsburg Emperor. This garden eventually transformed into what is now the beautiful Schönbrunn Gardens. Adrian Steckhoven spent the rest of his life in Vienna working as a director of the botanical garden, and he died there in 1782. Next, please. Before he left for Vienna, Adrian had handed over his nursery to his oldest daughter, Cornelia, and his son-in-law, Jacob Schuurman. Jacob had such respect for his father-in-law that he changed his name into Schuurman Steckhoven. Jacob was a skilled plant breeder himself, and he made headlines when the agave in his nursery bloomed and drew quite a crowd. Jacob was well aware of the latest developments in horticulture. He was one of the first nurserymen in Holland to sell hardy American trees and shrubs for gardens in a new landscape style. At first, he obtained these trees and shrubs from English nurseries around London. America being a British colony, English nurseries had easier access to American seeds and cuttings. And later on, Jacob started to grow these hardy trees and shrubs from North America himself. Next, please. Now, shipping small shrubs and trees from England to Holland wasn't much of a problem. However, shipping seeds and cuttings from America or Asia was not very successful most of the time. Often seeds and cuttings were affected by fungi or the salty sea spray, and some were also eaten by insects or rats. Transporting plant material remained very problematic for a long time, until the English physician Nathaniel Ward found a solution by chance in 1829. He discovered that by transporting plants in a sealed glass case, plants could survive the long voyage without watering and remain healthy. He put it to the test by sending some ferns in a sealed glass case to Sydney, Australia. The voyage took months, but the ferns were just fine on arrival. The case was sent back to England, filled with Australian plants, and these plants were also thriving when the case was unloaded in England. And thanks to the Wardian case, as it came to be called, overseas transport of plants became much easier. Next, please. Now, at the end of the 18th century, the Netherlands played hardly any part in the introduction of plants anymore. English plant hunters in particular had taken over. On behalf of the king, and with financial support from the English government, the Royal Horticultural Society, and successful London nurseries like that of the Veitch family, plant hunters traveled the world in search of new plants. Despite being outflanked by England, there was, however, one place left on earth where the East India Company had sole trading rights: the artificial Japanese island of Tsushima off Nagasaki. In 1823, Philip von Siebold arrived at Tsushima. He was a German physician who was employed by the East India Company. Von Siebold managed to win the trust of the Japanese authorities and was allowed to create a botanical garden and collect numerous Japanese plants. However, he was accused of stealing a map of Japan, which was considered espionage, and he was exiled in 1829. He had to leave his Japanese wife and their daughter behind, but managed to save his plant collection, and it was sent to Europe, where it ended up in both Belgian and Dutch nursery, including, by the way, the obnoxious Japanese knotweed. Next, please. Now, with the Japanese plants introduced by von Siebold, I want to conclude my presentation. We have seen bulbs coming to Europe from the Levant, as well as citrus trees from the Mediterranean. Ships from the East and West Indian companies brought small numbers of seeds and tubers from Southeast Asia, South Africa, and Central America to Europe in the 17th century. At the same time, Dutch ships also brought loads of trees to northern parts of Europe. And in the 18th century, hardy trees and shrubs from North America arrived in England and from there found their way to nurserymen in Holland and elsewhere. Skilled plant breeders like Adrian Steckhofer were able to cultivate all these new exotic plants with the help of new technologies like greenhouses and hothouses. These nurserymen achieved quite a feat, cultivating all these unknown exotic plants. We owe them great thanks. Thank you for your attention.